Good evening, I'm Joseph Dobrian, and for the next half hour I'm going to be reading to you from my brand new novel, Hardwired. Hardwired is available at Prairie Lights Books, available online at Amazon.com, or you can get it through my own website, josephdobrian.com. Now, when we left off last week, I was reading the part in which Andy Palinkas is telling us about his parents and what it was like growing up with them in the 1950s and 60s. And he was just about to start talking about his grandparents. And so that's where we will pick it up today. The Palinkas grandparents in Pittsburgh and the Dahlgren grandparents in suburban Minneapolis were culturally very different from each other. Both families had come over to America at about the same time, the 1850s, but Mom's folks made better choices. At any rate, the first Palinkas on these shores became a Civil War substitute. You know, in the Civil War, if you were drafted, if you could afford it, you could hire someone to go in your place, and someone hired Gabor Palinkas. Apparently he saw a lot of action, and then he came out of the army poor and with no more job skills than he had gone in with, which meant he was still only a working man. Somehow he got married and fathered 8 children, most of whom didn't do much better than he had done. The last of these was Grandpa Palinkas, born in 1882. Grandpa Palinkas did a little of this and a little of that, most of it legal, some not. He sold insurance and real estate. He was a small-time loan shark, bail bondsman, bookmaker. Dad grew up without a lot of money, but not truly poor. Dad was the second generation born in the States, so the Palinkases were completely American, but they still used a lot of Hungarian expressions. When we visited Pittsburgh, the dinner table was crowded and loud and exuberant. Dad was the 6th of 8 kids, the youngest son of a youngest son. The cuisine was rich and heavy on the paprika. Grandpa Palinkas used to drink this awful Hungarian liqueur called unicum, which tasted like that stuff that burns your throat when you throw up. He said it kept him from going bald. I should have drunk more of it myself. Mom had ancestors in the Civil War too, on both sides of her family. Both immigrants, both officers, one Swedish-born from Minnesota, the other Finnish-born from Wisconsin. The Palinkas family had been mainly hustlers who lived by their wits. The Dahlgrens from Minnesota and the Linas from Wisconsin were a complete contrast to that. They started out as good, stolid Lutheran farmers and became pillar of the community types. Grandpa Dahlgren ran several businesses too, but they were considerably more profitable than those of the Palinkases. Mom was Grandma and Grandpa Dahlgren's only child, and the Dahlgrens weren't big rich, but they were well off. It was because of Grandma and Grandpa Dahlgren that I knew I would never have to worry about money as long as I lived. They, as I understood from a very early age, would have nobody to leave their fortune to but my mother. And in turn, my parents would have nobody to leave it to but me and Mark. Moreover, Dad always made a pretty good living. I knew from the time that I first realized that some people have more money than others, that our family was considerably better off than most of our neighbors, especially since Mom would so often warn us not to say or do anything that might allow others to suspect that that was the case. Wealth, even our fairly modest wealth, embarrassed my mother. The Dahlgrens' household was more prosperous than that of my dad's parents, neater, with fewer people in it, and so very, very quiet. The only time it got noisy at the Dahlgren house was when Grandma and Grandpa Dahlgren decided to have one of their little bickering matches, which they habitually had a couple of times a day whenever I was visiting there. It was never anything big. It wouldn't last but a minute or so. But I got the impression that Grandma and Grandpa Dahlgren actually enjoyed pushing each other's buttons, pissing each other off. They also loved to put each other down, usually by trying to one-up each other on how knowledgeable or sophisticated they were. For example, if Grandpa Dahlgren used a word or expression that Grandma Dahlgren didn't know, he would explain it to her with a clearly implied, "Gosh, you didn't know that?" which would inspire Grandma Dahlgren to retaliate. Or Grandpa Dahlgren would make some remark about Grandma's weight. She might suggest that he was losing his marbles. Always something. Once, when I was little, after I had witnessed one of these sessions, I asked Mom when we were in private, why do Grandma and Grandpa still live together if they don't like each other? Mom laughed, and in that soft, almost whispery voice of hers, she said, oh, that's what they do. They have their little arguments, but they have a lot of fun together, too. Did you really think they didn't like each other? Did they always do like that, I asked. Every day, said Mom. Every day, for as long as I can remember. Maybe that's where Mom got it from. Mom was by no means consistently disparaging or critical or cruel to me. I can think of a lot of times when she was okay, kind and pleasant and gracious to me the way you would expect a mother to be. Kind and pleasant and gracious the way Mom invariably was to everyone outside our family. But the times I remember most vividly are the times when she was angry at me, disappointed in me, disgusted by me, exasperated with me. Sure, I can remember a few times in my life when she praised me without condition. One or two times when she said, I'm proud of you, Andy. But not many. If you feel personally insecure to begin with, the criticisms and the put-downs will stay with you forever. The praise you mostly forget. Well, no, that's not completely true. There was one thing that Mom would truly seem to appreciate about me. When I was a teenager, she did praise me for my theatrical performances in school plays. She enjoyed those, and she told me so, which makes what happened later all the harder to explain. I'm pretty sure it was not generally known. Mom came across as perfectly nice and normal to outsiders, I'm sure, but Mom was not a happy person. It must have been plain old clinical depression, the kind that gets controlled with medication nowadays. I'm assuming that was what she had. Sometimes she seemed fine like any other woman her age, but quite often, more days when it was than it wasn't, I dare say, her general manner was sad, gloomy, as though she were contemplating some deep, unnamed sorrow that was always at least in the background of her mind. Every now and then, maybe every couple of years, she would go through a period of a week or two where she would be only barely functional. In bed all day for days at a time, able to get out of bed and get dressed only if she absolutely had to, but not much more than that. Most of the time, Mom was pretty regular, quiet, controlled, but sometimes she would snap and turn on me, verbally, with some quick remark that made me feel like I didn't deserve to live, and which I swear was calculated to have that effect. Almost always I had the feeling that whatever I did, I was going to let Mom down somehow, sadden her, piss her off, remind her of what a louse I was, and earn myself another of her put-downs. Andy, I'm concerned about how much you eat. I heard that all the time, from about age 8 onwards. I didn't eat that awful much. I was overweight mostly from inactivity. But like most boys of that age, I was hungry almost all the time. And if I took a pickle or a bit of cheese from the refrigerator between meals, I would often get a from Mom. If I helped myself to seconds at dinner, I'd get a look. One morning, I'm pretty sure it was a Saturday, a rainy morning when I was 9 or 10 years old. This was when we were living in Wisconsin still. I announced after breakfast that I was going to start exercising more to lose weight. Mom said, "That's fine, Andy." Then and there, in the middle of the living room, I started doing windmills, touching the fingers of one hand to the opposite foot to loosen myself up. "You've got to put more into it," said Mom after I had touched each toe once or twice. Apparently I wasn't doing the windmills fast enough or with sufficient élan or whatever. Well, for God's sake, they were just stretches. And I was just starting out. And windmills aren't the easiest thing for a fat kid to do. I stopped what I was doing, I straightened up, and I admit I gave Mom a rather pained look. "Mom." "Oh, I don't care," she cried. "Go ahead, be fat." She flounced out of the living room, down the hall to her and Dad's bedroom, where she slammed the door behind her. Mom could do the dramatic flounce like nobody else I ever met. I sometimes imagined hearing an orchestral sting like in a movie soundtrack, chung, whenever she did it, you know. I couldn't help it. I wailed. I didn't cry that time. It was a primal yell. I didn't know how to let Mom know that I was displeased, except to make her hear it through the bedroom door. About 10 minutes later, Mom came out of the bedroom and apologized. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. I shouldn't have said it." Okay, fine, but she had said it. And that was the end of the exercising for a long time, because I had now found out what would happen if I tried it where Mom could see me trying it. I remember another incident from roughly that same time. I was in maybe the 5th grade. It was the end of a quarter at school, and I had brought home my report card. So had Mark. Mark had also brought a couple of friends over to play. I rarely had friends over after school. Mark frequently did. And right there, with Mark and his friends in the living room having milk and cookies, Mom looked at my grades and exclaimed aloud, "Andy, this is a poor report card." Mark kept his face expressionless, but his friends all smiled at each other and then sidelong at me. And I didn't have the courage then or later to ask Mom how she dared to do that. I don't know. She might have apologized. Or she might have said something like, "If I had brought home a report card like that, I would expect my parents to say something about it too and not care who heard it." Dad I got along with most of the time. He just wasn't there as much as Mom when I was a kid. He worked hard and he was at the office a lot. On weekends, he did yard work or tinkered with his car. This was a traditional post-war home where the father went out to make a living and the mother stayed home and brought up the kids. From Dad, I occasionally got praise for this or that. Sometimes he would be a bit too kind. Like if I bemoaned my lack of athletic skill, he might say, "Oh, don't be so hard on yourself. You're not a star, but you're average." No, Dad, I wasn't average. I was bottom of the barrel. Or, and this would make me cringe, sometimes Dad would come home from work and he'd greet me with, "How's my handsome boy?" I knew he was trying to make me feel better, because how could he not know I was ugly? He had one good eye in his head. To have a younger brother who is better than you in every way, who can beat you at anything, that has got to be the worst thing in the world. I knew as soon as Mark started to toddle that he was more what my parents had in mind, what Mom had in mind anyway. I could see why. He was certainly cuter than I ever was, with bright black eyes and a big grin. I tend to scowl, and my eyes were a sort of sickly olive green. As I got older, my eyes gradually changed color, and they're more of a true dark green now, which I like, because that eye color on a human being is quite unusual. Back then, though, my eyes were 2 more points against me in my assessment. Mark gave my parents less trouble than I did, I'm sure. I must have been a source of annoyance to my parents, and maybe embarrassment, because of my temper, my crying, my contrariness. And I suppose it was perfectly natural that when I started going off to school, leaving Mark and Mom alone, she would bond with Mark more closely than she ever did with me. I understand that. I don't hold it against her. As we got older, it became apparent that Mark was the better specimen. By the time he was 5 and I was 7, he was beating me at simple card games like concentration. Even before that, he had learned the trick to pulling a wishbone, which is to hold still and let the other person pull so that he'll snap off the short end. I suppose it's possible that someone taught him that trick to give him a boost, to keep me from beating him because he was younger and smaller. Or maybe he figured out for himself. He was brighter than I was. Mark had friends. I didn't. Sure, I had playmates now and then, and I was on civil terms with a few kids in the classroom. But even these kids, with only a few exceptions, would be unable to resist having a little fun with me. You know, when that one ineffectual, unattractive, easily provoked kid loses his cool, it's almost impossible not to bait him a bit more to see how far he'll take it. Thus, I went through my elementary and high school years regarding practically everybody with suspicion. And usually, one way or another, my suspicion was justified, even if, in the final analysis, I brought my woes upon myself. I wish I had learned to fight. I wish I had learned to throw a punch and make it hurt. I wish I had learned to seriously damage another kid just by using my hands and my feet if I wanted to. I was no good at sports and I wasn't strong for my size, but I could have built up my strength. I could have learned the techniques for breaking a kid's nose or even his kneecap. I don't mean I necessarily would have done it, but if I had just known that I could do it, could with one swift blow put a kid in the hospital or give him an injury that he'd carry for the rest of his life, it might have given me the confidence to stand up to those little shits. Who can say why I wouldn't stand my ground, why I couldn't turn myself into a terrifying person whom the other kids would have been afraid to fuck with? Another kid in my place might have done that. I didn't have the courage. On my way to and from school practically every day, I would be taunted and harassed by a group of anywhere from 3 to 4 to 7 or 8 kids. It was usually just verbal, but sometimes I would be hit or shoved or kicked in the ass or have my toes stepped on. I got spat on a couple of times. At least once a week, usually much oftener, I would arrive at home or school in tears. Finally, my parents, I can't recall which one, suggested that if Mark and I walked together, the other kids might lay off me since they didn't have anything against Mark. We tried it and it usually worked. Not because Mark was any physical threat, he was little and skinny, but for some reason the kids were reticent about attacking me when Mark was along. So here I was taking my little brother with me for protection. If you don't have any clue what that can do to a kid's self-esteem, you can thank God for it. By the time Mark was 6 and I was 8, when we played with the neighbor kids, little Palinkas was getting chosen before big Palinkas for games. Also starting at that age, Mark could beat me consistently at chess. Now I maybe could have been as good a player as he was, but one thing Mark had that I didn't have at all was patience. To get good at chess requires study and deep thought. Above all, it requires enough self-control to not make the first move that looks good to you. Patience and self-control, I never had those qualities. Mark never lacked them. When I was 11 and Mark was 9, Dad taught us to play golf, which Dad himself wasn't very good at because he had such poor depth perception on account of having just the one eye. And Mark would invariably beat me by a few strokes, even though I was stronger than he was and consistently outdrove him. Again, patience and self-control. Mark had them, I didn't. In addition to excelling at chess, Mark learned to play the accordion quite well. Our house in Waukesha, where I spent the first 14 years of my life, was way too small for us. It was a 2-bedroom starter house, and for some reason, Mom wouldn't move out of it. We could have afforded to. By the time I was a few years old, Dad was doing well financially, but Mom had a phobia, a dread that something awful would happen if we moved out of that house. She knew not what, but it would be something unspeakable, a ghastly misfortune. Or maybe someone in the family, maybe herself, would go mad and murder the rest of us. I didn't find this out till only a few years ago. Dad explained it to me in his last months after Mom had died. I had always had the idea that Mom was keeping us in that little house just out of general cussedness. Or maybe she wanted to keep us humble, not let anyone know that we were better off than we looked. That would have been like her. But according to my father, many years after the fact, the real reason why we stayed in that cramped little house long after our family had outgrown it was so that nobody would get killed. It was a plain 1-story tract house with a living room, an eat-in kitchen, bath, and 2 bedrooms, much like all the other houses in the neighborhood. A residential neighborhood where nothing much ever happened, this was. We had a few nice pieces of furniture, which I gathered had been handed down mainly by the Dahlgren grandparents, but it was all at pretty tight quarters. We had an upright piano in our living room. Mom knew how to play it a little, but for the first several years of my life, I don't clearly remember her playing ever in my presence. I certainly don't remember hearing her play after Mark was born, and I have only the vaguest memories of her playing during my babyhood. So vague that they might even be manufactured memories. At any rate, that piano stood in our living room as a sort of icon of what once had been, a piece of statuary rather than a musical instrument. I didn't show any interest in learning to play that piano. Sometimes as a toddler, I would idly hit a few keys for the sake of making a sound, and I understood that some keys made loud, dark notes and some made light, high notes. But that was all I knew about the piano and all I cared to know. Mom must have told me at one time or another that she used to play it. That could account for my possibly manufactured memory of having heard her play when I was a baby. But she never offered to teach me to play, and I never asked her to. Mark, when he was about 5, did start getting interested in the piano. As soon as his hands were barely big enough to stretch comfortably across 5 keys, Mom gave him his first lessons. She taught him to play Mary Had a Little Lamb and Chopsticks. First time I can be certain that I heard her play. And pretty soon, Mark was good enough to need a professional teacher. I remember Mom asking me when Mark started taking lessons whether I would like them too. I recall it was late in the summer, right before I was to start 2nd grade, and Mark was to start kindergarten. It was over the dinner table one evening when she told Mark about the arrangements she had made. Then she turned to me and said, "Andy, Daddy and I don't want you to feel that Mark is getting any special attention. If you want music lessons too, or if you can think of anything else you'd like to pursue, just say so." But when Mom made that offer, I told her, "No thanks, I wouldn't keep it up. You know how I am." Which, looking back, was a strange thing for a 7-year-old boy to say. I guess it showed more insight than most 7-year-olds would have had, right? Mom said, "That's what I thought, but I hope you know that we're not trying to favor Mark at all. If you change your mind, let us know." Okay, fine. I knew at the time that Mom meant it. But I wouldn't take her up on it because I knew that whatever interest I decided to pursue, I would never be as proficient at it as Mark was at whatever he decided to get good at. Even at that young age, I understood, if perhaps imperfectly, that to excel at a musical instrument would require a great deal of practice. Boring, frustrating, maddening practice that would keep me from doing other things like doing nothing. Mark at first seemed indifferent to his piano lessons. He didn't show any promise of becoming proficient, not for a good year or so. Then, shortly after he had turned 6, this happened. It was a summer evening, and we were visiting Grandma and Grandpa Palinkas in Pittsburgh. I always used to enjoy visiting there because usually one or another of Dad's brothers or sisters would be visiting with their families too. And the house would be pretty crowded, so Mark and I would get to sleep out on the screen porch, sometimes with several of our cousins. I didn't much mind the close quarters under those circumstances, because the cousins would invariably know some jokes or stories that I hadn't heard yet. Grandma and Grandpa Palinkas lived in a working-class residential neighborhood, little more urbanized than the neighborhood we lived in Waukesha, but not much more so at that. It consisted of older frame houses, mostly built around 1900, I should guess. That evening, it was after dinner, but not yet dark. Mark and the cousins and I were in the grandparents' front yard, playing freeze tag, as I recall, when from the front door of the house across the street emerged a young man, maybe 20 years or so, clean-cut Joe College type. He was carrying an accordion. He sat down on the steps of the front porch of that house and he started playing. After a few seconds of hearing that instrument, Mark dropped out of the game and ran across the street. I remember I shouted at him real quick, "Look both ways," even though there was no traffic. Mark stopped himself, and he did, and then he crossed. He ran over to this guy and stood in the yard of that house next to the front porch listening. I stayed in the game for another minute or so, but then I went across the street to listen too. The other kids all trailed behind me. The young man smiled at us. He was obviously flattered. He played another song or two, then he stopped playing and asked us if we wanted to know more about his instrument. He gave us a quick explanation of what it was and how it worked. Then he let us each try to play a few notes, and Mark was hooked. For the next few months, when Mom would take us to the public library in Waukesha, he would check out records of accordion music. He would listen to them over and over on the hi-fi in our living room, sitting there perfectly still with this hypnotized, almost rapturous expression on his face. He was only just entering first grade then, still learning to read, but I'm sure he would have checked out books on the accordion if he could have read them. He began pestering Mom and Dad about whether he might have an accordion for Christmas. He got one, a lightweight one that he could manage. A full-size accordion is a heavy instrument. It takes some upper body strength to play. I was given the latest edition of the World Book Encyclopedia, on the understanding that it was for family use, of course, but officially mine, which I regarded as an even more splendid present. I wasn't as focused as Mark, but I was interested in knowledge for its own sake. I wore out those encyclopedias over the next few years, the way Mark wore out that accordion before he graduated to a full-size model. Knowledge for its own sake. At that age, that was a thing for me. It always has been to this day. My happiest memories of those third and fourth grades were the times when I would be curled up on my bed, poring over one volume or another of those encyclopedias. I read them over and over and over again. It was a way of getting lost. I bet I could still recite a lot of the World Book from memory. When I was reading those books, I was escaping. I wasn't Andy Palinkas anymore. I wasn't a stinky little kid living in a too-small house. I'm not sure what else I was, but I was no longer a boy. I was a wise and learned man seeing the world, even if only from the vantage point of my bed. I read a lot, like tons. If I went outside, I usually had a book with me. I can hardly remember a time when I couldn't read. By the time I was 5 years old, I could read more fluently than some of my adult babysitters. And I know because I sometimes had to correct them when they read aloud to me. I have to say that's one thing my parents did right. They encouraged me to read. They gave me good books. I read all the standard boy stuff, Treasure Island, Tom Sawyer, the Freddy series about a talking pig who was a detective. And by the time I was in fourth grade, I was reading Greek and Norse mythology. By the sixth grade, I was reading Dickens and various histories. I was certainly the best read kid in my neighborhood. You know what's the trouble about being a well-read kid, though? The mispronunciations. I guess I should have realized that I tended to mispronounce words because I knew so much, not because I knew so little. I would rhyme protege with cortege, or avenger with scavenger, Damocles with fried cockles, and so on. I would pronounce misled as misled. I'm still trying to forget the first time I tried to say Goethe. Childhood is one prolonged mortification. The fact that we didn't have a television set certainly had something to do with my reading so much. It's a funny thing because Mom and Dad liked movies, and they would take Mark and me to the movies sometimes, usually Disney or a lighthearted adult comedy. But there was no TV in our house. One might think that in retrospect I would be glad I was deprived of TV growing up because it forced me to read, but no, that was one thing my parents did wrong. My parents, uniquely among all the parents in our neighborhood, refused to buy a TV set. It would have poisoned my mind and Mark's. That's how Dad explained it to us. There were so many other better ways to spend our time. He and Mom didn't want us filling up our minds with a lot of foolishness. And that, I think, is a good place to stop for this time, but I will be back next week with another half hour's reading from my novel, Hardwired. Thanks for listening. Good night.